Anyway, he said he had already talked too much and really had to go now. He turned to the house and disappeared. "Good luck to you," was all I could say for goodbye. Walking back, I tried to form a coherent picture of the things I had learned this afternoon. I did not take the direct way back. I needed time. First, it was the dramatic bluntness of the German general's order of the day at the Eastern Front. "Self-sacrifice is duty," that rang in my ear and made my idealistic and somewhat romantic mind respond. Thrown into the turmoil of war at that age, I was no exception in my eagerness to make a contribution as soon as I was old enough. There was a good deal of daydreaming involved. It had to be something special, such as joining the paratroops and then being assigned to some daredevil jump behind the Russian lines. Against this background, Philip's version of the Waffen-SS and its pan-European dimension had a new and strong attraction. Aside from the hope it offered in the gloomy atmosphere of that winter, I had the vague notion of something new coming into being, an entirely new perspective, perhaps even going beyond the war and the old rivalries of European nations. Could it be the new Reich, evoked in Stefan George's poem, of which I can remember only the last lines? Führt durch Sturm und grausige Signale des Frustrots seine treuen Schar zum Werk. Des wachen Tags und pflanzt das neue Reich. And yet I wasn't ready for a commitment. That would come later. I only felt the need for clarity. Perhaps I could bring up the subject with Wolf if he was still awake. When I came back to the house, however, Wolf was gone. There had been a phone call requesting him to report to Berlin the next day. He had left in the car. It's hard to explain what, in the end, made me decide to join the Waffen-SS. Back in 1942, I didn't ask myself that question. But now, in 1945, it has become important. What made a youth of 17, coming from a decent family, go astray and become a member of what the Allies had now branded as a criminal gang? How did it happen? What went wrong? Primarily, I think it was the unfavourable course the war had taken at that time in the fall of 1942 and the differing responses to the worsening prospects among those of my age group. On one side, there were those who were anxious to come through the war unscathed. On the other were those who felt this was the time to redouble their efforts to win the war. In retrospect, it seems these two attitudes affected one another in a polarizing way. To explain that, however, I should go back and describe life at home in that third year of the war. It was on an afternoon early in September when I was out in the forest with Christina. She had come up the ladder and reached the little platform of the hunter's tree stand, her face flushed with joy. Her hazel-brown eyes, radiant and, as usual, somewhat mischievous, seemed to say, "See? I made it. You thought I wouldn't, didn't you?" For it had not been easy to skip the 2 rotten rungs on her way up. We couldn't stand up under the low roof and had to crouch on the small bench. The gap in front opened on a view of a wide glade sloping down to a creek surrounded by stands of firs. Among them, a few maples and beeches glowed in the afternoon sun. There was no sound except that of the wind wafting through the tall yellow grass, tossing gossamer in the air and springing up to the treetops in their slow, swinging motion. The air was rich with the pungent scent of the conifers and of the needles on the ground that had been soaking up the heat of the sun and were now exhaling. We loved this place, our hideaway, in the wooded hills far back of the Blesheim castle, from which we had walked for almost an hour. For us, this place was the essence of home. We belonged to it, and it belonged to us. It was a place of happiness, where we knew best that we were in love with each other. To be here was a rare opportunity, though, and some contrivance had been necessary to enable us to sneak off together and cover up our tracks. Besides, our various duties and activities left little time for a whole afternoon with one another. School, homework, our many duties as leaders in the Jungvolk and the Jungmadel, the 2 youth organizations for young boys and girls, sports, various athletics in summer and gymnastics and skiing in winter, and music lessons, which in my case meant violin lessons and school orchestra. There wasn't much time left for school either, which explains my being a rather poor pupil who manoeuvred through the gymnasium only by shining in some lessons I liked, German, foreign languages, history, and leaving others more or less aside, mathematics in particular. For all its importance, school was just one of the things we were engaged in at that time. Christina's mother thought her daughter was occupied with one of these activities that afternoon. She would certainly have objected if she had known about the two of us together in the woods. Our families, however, knew of our circle of friends. They knew all the names from the time we had our first dancing class, and they certainly knew that somehow love was involved. My mother had no desire to know too much. She was, as she used to say, unable to supervise all of her 4 children's doings, my father having been away for 3 years now, and therefore had no choice but to rely on her offspring's substance. Christina was 16 then, slender with a bouncing, sporting gait emphasized by her bobbing brown ponytail. Her skin was tan by nature, and her slanted, long-lashed eyes over her high cheekbones and her small nose gave her a rather striking look. We had been talking all the way up here, small things about school, teachers, our friends, and the various relationships between them, endless topics at that age. Talking and being together was about all one could expect from this gentle love affair. Except for an occasional movie, further diversions or escapades were beyond our reach in wartime. All the same, we did not think we were missing anything. Now, up in our blind, we were silent, in harmony with our surroundings. After a while, Christina looked up and said in a low voice, "Let's close our eyes and wish for something. One wish for each of us." With that, she closed her eyes, and I saw her eyelashes nestling down on her cheeks as softly as a butterfly lowering its wings on a warm stone in the sun. "Tell me your wish," she asked. "I want to kiss you," I said. "I knew you would say that," she replied, and mischievously added, "So I have picked a different wish for myself." "You tell me later," I said, kissing first her eyelids and then her lips. "We must stop now, please," she said, freeing herself, and after a while, "Don't you want to know my wish?" "Sure, I almost forgot. Tell me." She paused, musing and looking at the glade. When our eyes met, hers had become dark. With a voice huskier than usual, she said, "I wished that when this war is over, we would meet again, here at our place, you and me, as soon as both of us are back." We kissed again, knowing that for us the time for real love had not yet come, and that when it did, we would be on duty somewhere far from each other. The shadow of the war that had hung over our youth from the beginning had reached us even here. There was no sanctuary, yet she smiled a brave and somewhat sad smile, her eyes full of love. It was getting dark, time to leave. When I came home, my mother said there had been a letter from my father in the mail. He was coming home on leave, and he had good news of my brother Nick, who, after passing his final exams at the gymnasium, had been drafted and was now at the Eastern Front, apparently within reach of my father. I also got a letter from my friend Hans, who had joined the paratroops and wrote enthusiastically about his jump training. The day before, I had learned that my predecessor in my present function in the Jungvolk had been promoted to lieutenant in the infantry. My unrest at continuing to lead a relatively peaceful life in private was steadily increasing. Looking forward to my father's leave, my mother had been in a talkative mood, so after supper we had one of the long talks we used to have in my last year at home. To discuss current affairs, indeed everything under the sun, was for her a vital need, just as a cat needs to sharpen its claws on bark from time to time. I was then, next to her, the eldest member of the family at home, so the role of partner in our discussions had fallen upon me. My mother was understanding when we discussed once more my intention of enlisting. It must have seemed quite natural to her that young people of my age were responding in that way to the call of duty, for this was in accordance with her generation's experience in similar circumstances over 20 years before. Her generation, however, had experienced a world war being lost, and in the years before the current war she had never concealed her nagging doubts about our leadership after the Versailles Diktat, and its ability to restore our national dignity with prudence, that is, without waging war. Regarding the odd set of party officials on the local and regional level, my father used to call them the party comics, How could one possibly believe that the political personnel as a whole were equal to the tasks with which the nation was now confronted? After all, for most of them, their only experience with managing violence was restricted to brawls in bars and street riots before 1933. Now we were at war with most of the world. The basic theme underlying almost all our talks was my parents' ambivalent relationship to National Socialism. Both came from families which for generations had been merchants, bankers, domain tenants, executives, lawyers, and civil servants. Their characters were formed by a basically conservative attitude, as well as by their experience of World War I and its aftermath. For all their basic convictions, it seemed to them inevitable and morally imperative that some sort of societal restructuring should follow the war. The Fronterlebnis, the comradeship of the front, the hardships jointly endured in the field, the joint efforts of all classes for a common cause during the 4 long years of the war, could not be ignored. Rather, it was a matter of justice that a modern society without class barriers be formed, based on equal opportunities and a person's own efforts and achievements. Bringing down class barriers and acknowledging the value of any useful or creative form of work was one of my mother's favourite ideas. At the same time, their experience with Germany's defeat and with the penalties imposed at Versailles, perceived as unfair punitive actions, had made them open to the idea of national identity and what was left of national pride. Another important part of my parents' experience was the Bolsheviks' various attempts to usurp power in post-war Germany. My father had been with a Freikorps in the Baltics for some time after the war. Later on, in 1920, he had witnessed the armed insurrection of communists in the Ruhr area and the arrival of political commissars from Russia. Then, against this background, both had followed the brutal struggle of the communists for political power in Berlin. My mother used to tell about communist quarters in Brunswick, where, after the war, people of her kind were well advised to stay out lest they be stoned. For them, as for most Germans at that time, all this experience was evidence enough of the actual and continual danger of Germany becoming Bolshevized. I had often heard them talk of the need to withstand the Bolshevik menace and of the importance of establishing a genuine reconciliation of the classes as a prerequisite, an aim which National Socialism, in their view, was most likely to achieve. In this connection, their thinking was also formed by the unfavourable picture of Germany's recent feeble parliamentarian governments and their incapacity for coping with our post-war problems, the communist menace in particular. They certainly felt it was time for someone to accumulate and use political power to bring about strong joint action. Basically well disposed towards National Socialism for these reasons, after 1933, my mother had decided to join the movement, not as a mere hanger-on, but as an active member. Her interest in public affairs dated from her days when, at home in Brunswick and Hardenberg, she had listened to her parents' conversations. Her father had written his PhD thesis on Marx's Das Kapital and was throughout his professional life involved in public affairs. Through him, she had come to like the art of dispute. She thought it her duty to make a contribution, and she scorned those of the educated class, the intellectuals in particular, who, standing aside, thought themselves above making a commitment toward the goals of a labourers' party. She once said that no one was entitled to criticise unless he actually involved himself in making things better. In our nightly discussions at home, however, she used to play the devil's advocate. She would question any official political position so I could work out my own opinions on political developments such as the ever-expanding war fronts, the boastful speeches that betrayed an underestimation of our opponents, the brutal actions against political dissenters, and other misdeeds of party officials. I sensed, however, that she expected from our discussions some reassurance about the justness of our cause. She liked to sum up one of her more severe criticisms in the reproach that the Nazis, even then the pejorative term for National Socialists, didn't behave much better than the Bolsheviks. Then it was my turn to set out the reasons for the justness of the Nazis' behaviour, that the justness of our cause justified the means that were necessary to retaliate for the merciless brutalities of our enemy in the East. She would insist on her position, however, such as, "Evil will never be destroyed. Usually it is inherited by the other side, one of her carefully coined, sometimes astonishing conclusions that resulted from her penchant for wrestling for days, sometimes weeks, with aspects of public affairs that worried her. One basic idea used to prevail in our talks, that after so short a period of time, not even 10 years, the Third Reich was in a state of transition that would produce a new stage in German society and its position in the world. Restoration of the Hohenzollern monarchy in any form was unthinkable, and it was evident that a new political elite was needed to replace the set that had emerged from the Kampfzeit, the period before 1933, when the National Socialists struggled for political power. The war, we hoped, would help forge that new elite. Seasoned by the hardships of war service, they would return to or enter professional life and take the place of the party people as soon as the war was over. In particular, we thought this new elite would possess a profound notion of what it really meant to serve the common good. We were quite aware, however, that the longer the war lasted, the more that idea would lose its bearing as the casualties of the war actually diminished the ranks from which that elite might grow. All in all, this may not have been the utmost in political wisdom, but at the moment it had at least some plausibility. It was, at any rate, entirely different from the picture of Nazidom that I would eventually read about in the Stars and Stripes, according to which the evil course of the system was clearly visible from the outset. It is true that anything could happen under totalitarian rule, but it is also true that nothing was bound to happen. The person of Hitler remained untouched in our critical talks. To think of him as an irresponsible gambler and fanatic, as I am beginning to see him now, his suicide confirming that judgment, or even to think of him as capable of getting down to the extermination of the Jews under German control, was far beyond what we could conceive. My parents found Hitler's hate of the Jews repulsive. The SS paper Der Stürmer, with its ugly caricatures of Jews, was often cited by them as a paradigm of political vulgarity, but they saw this propaganda as just part of the revolutionary thrust of the movement and as wartime exaggerations that would recede as soon as the war was over. Besides, from what we could see, hear, or read during the Third Reich, there were no indications of any large-scale crimes one reads about now, and the extent of which is still to me mind-boggling. Certainly in 1938, after the German diplomat had been shot in Paris by the Jewish assassin Grinspan, there had been Kristallnacht, the breaking of windows of Jewish shops in our town, and some other acts of violence. This incident, however, was one of those events my mother had furiously denounced in her local women's organization, postulating that those responsible for the outrages were a disgrace to the party, just the kind of Radikalinskis that were no better than the Bolsheviks. In her eyes, they were the faction that must be kept down. I know little of any personal relations my family had with Jews. If there were any, they were not much discussed. The one of which I was aware was a high judge living across the street from my grandparents in Brunswick, a fellow of distinguished character, fond of playing in string quartets, who in the past sometimes would ask my Uncle Peter over to help out with the second violin. Outright anti-Semitism certainly wasn't part of my parents' thinking. As I recall occasional remarks, however, it becomes clear that there were certain reservations about Jews in general, and certain signs of decadence my parents found disgusting in our cultural life in the 1920s were associated with Jewish influence. I remember another more significant point in their critical attitude, the role they assigned to Jewish intellectuals in the Russian Revolution and Bolshevik ideology, which the Germans, they thought, were destined to resist. It touched a string in my parents' minds when Nazi propaganda associated the evil influence of Jewish intellectuals on Bolshevism with their rootless existence in the diaspora. We knew, of course, of concentration camps. To our knowledge, they were labour camps where conditions were hard but just. Had we known the official rule of conduct in those camps, Arbeit macht frei, work makes one free, we readily would have consented. If, on the other hand, we had known of or suspected any willful killings in the camps, which must have begun on a large scale about the time of my political discussions with my mother, our talks would have taken a different course, and our attitude would have radically changed. This thought is, I admit, a hypothesis and one of little consequence. But had the people in general known, I think that neither the killings nor the war could have continued in any meaningful way. It seems inconceivable from this distance that any authority in the Third Reich could have let the killings become public, could have taken any responsibility for them, and continued to stay in office. Inconceivable, too, that German soldiers, officers as well as plain soldiers, let alone a few fanatics, would have been ready to go on risking their lives for a cause so utterly corrupted. That kind of general knowledge would have delivered the death blow to any military morale. That, in fact, both had taken place at the same time can only be perceived under the condition that the doings inside the camps were surrounded by absolute secrecy. That the war continued is, I think, strong evidence against the assumption that the German people knew what was going on. I forget which subject in particular we discussed on that evening in September 1942. At that time I felt that I personally had little part in the past, that the political choices had not been for me to make, and that the only thing that mattered at present was that there was a war on that had to be won. The war had become our destiny, my destiny. I was left with the inescapable question of my age group. What are you going to do for your country? That one question became deeply engraved on our maturing minds during the war years. My response was simple enough: serve the best way I could. There was nothing specific in that, except for the vague notion of belonging to a group that would have more than its normal share of duties. It was long after midnight on that night in September 1942 when we ended our talk. I put out the light and opened the curtains, drawn closed for the blackout, to let in fresh air. Moonlight poured into the room, and I could see the outlines of two familiar objects on top of the bookcase by the window: my father's World War I steel helmet and his sword. The next day at school, I made my decision. On that morning, Dr. Weyrich, our headmaster and English teacher, strode briskly into the classroom. Cheerfully rubbing his hands, his rosy face in a broad smile, he said, "Good morning, gentlemen. Please sit down. What are we going to do on this lovely morning? I think we'll write a little exercise." All in excellent English, of course. With that, we were asked to take a dictation. I've forgotten the subject of the text and its origin, but I remember that it was, in the circumstances, a subtle piece of insinuation. He was an Anglophile. Having spent some years abroad, he felt compelled to hand down to his pupils some knowledge of British customs and character that he found worth following. He would explain that, for instance, while in German a prohibition against something was usually expressed as Rauchen verboten, smoking forbidden, the English way of putting it was, please don't smoke. With regard to the Luftwaffe's offensive against targets in England, he would, visibly annoyed by the loud-mouthed German propaganda, warn against the illusion that British morale would be broken by it. "You think we'll bring them to heel? No, sir," he would say, wagging his forefinger like a metronome. "It will result in the opposite. It'll only stiffen their backbones. Believe me." It was not his Anglophilia, however, that endeared Weyrich to his pupils and their parents. It was generally known that he had been transferred to our school as headmaster for disciplinary reasons. In his former position as head of a department in the Brunswick Ministry of Education, he had refused to sign a letter of dismissal for a teacher who had resisted pressure to separate from his Jewish wife. My parents, associating with the Weyrichs privately, were glad to have that kind of teacher in charge of their son's education, while we, his pupils, had great respect for him. It was during the next lesson that the two different currents in our class surfaced. There were those whose attitude toward the war was like my own, for whom the war was a personal challenge, and who were eager to make a commitment. Then there were those who regarded the war as the business of others, particularly of volunteers, and who thought that no idea was worth the sacrifice of human life, at least not their own, and who were, therefore, looking for a safe haven to wait for the war to end. Of course, these two different currents were not as clear and pure as I set them out here. There certainly were various impurities. There were varying degrees of romanticism or personal ambitions on the one hand, and personal weakness, intellectual or moral reticence, or sober calculation about the ultimate outcome of the war on the other. Nor were these currents clearly visible. They surfaced only occasionally, and when they did, it was in some oblique way. Our second lesson was German with Dr. Hinz. Handicapped by a shortened leg and a wooden arm, he had joined the party early in the 20s when he studied German and history at the University of Munich. Endowed with a remarkable capacity for rhetoric and a sharp intellect combined with a peculiar mixture of refined and coarse language, he assumed the responsibility of public speaker for the party as a sideline. In his lessons, he used to wander easily from matters of the German language to topics of history, and from there to current politics, where he would display, in passing, an impressive amount of insider information. His occasional snide swipes at certain party moguls or attitudes were especially popular, not least because they betrayed an astonishingly accurate knowledge of criticism currently circulating among the people. On that morning, we resumed the subject of the Gothic War. For me, the Gothic War had all the elements of a drama. It was full of conflicts of characters and ideas, of love and death, of fortune and ruin. The events lay far back in the mist of history, some 1400 years ago, the age when great myths were born, the Nibelungen, King Arthur, Lancelot, and last but not least, Dietrich von Bern, the great Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths. Altogether, it was a setting that let the contesting figures and concepts appear untainted and flawless in the way the young of any age want the world to be. We had been reading Procopius's Gothic War in our history lessons, and in parallel, Felix Dahn's A Struggle for Rome in the German lessons, both an exercise in the critical reading of a historical novel against the background of historical sources. Hinz requested we write an essay on the novel, each of us free to choose his own specific subject. This morning we were to indicate our different subjects and to describe a brief outline for discussion. Various subjects came up: the question of racial superiority, the justness of the cause, what business had the Goths in Italy anyway, the Lebensraum argument, and then the characters of the last two Gothic kings, Totila and Teja, and their Roman antagonist Cethegus. All of these topics were discussed with no explicit reference to the present. It was my classmate Krug who dashed forward with the daring thesis that basically the Gothic War was a case of poor leadership, nothing less and nothing more. Krug, a blond youth with soft features and a rather lavish hairstyle, had a sharp, analytical intellect, loved disputes, and was fond of knocking down the positions of others. Combined with this ability was a deep distrust of all convictions, even his own. "I deny that one can call it a tragedy," he declared. "It simply was foolish for the Goths to stay in Italy after Justinian made it clear he didn't want them in the region. They, a thin stratum of warriors, couldn't hope to conquer the whole world as it was then perceived." "So, what do you think the Goths' leaders should have done instead?" Hinz asked. "Well, it's hard to say. Perhaps they should have listened to the envoy of their relatives from the north who had urged them to return to where they came from, to Gotland," Krug replied. "Aren't you judging from hindsight? At the time the Gothic envoy arrived, Totila, their king, was the absolute ruler of Rome, wasn't he?" Hinz objected. "Yes, I know," Krug said, "and 2 years later, Totila and his people were wiped out. Prudent leadership should have seen that the reign of so few over so many was doomed from the outset." "But it lasted for 50 years, and it had worked in other cases," Hinz insisted. "Didn't the Normans succeed and the Saxons before them?" "Your analogy has a flaw. In the case of the Goths, barbarians tried to subject an old civilization to their rule. Not so in the case of Britain. Perhaps you would accept the reign of the Romans over the Greeks as an example," Hinz proposed. "But I shouldn't do all the talking. What's your opinion, Voss?" he asked, looking at me. "I think Krug's view is rather superficial," I began. "The crucial question is what the Gothic kings and their advisers thought they could compromise on, and what they thought was inalienable. Obviously the Goths perceived Italy as their home country, as their Lebensraum, living space, after their ancestors had left Gotland, and later had been expelled from the Black Sea. How can you give up your home?" "I see. Next he'll say, 'Just like ourselves, fighting for Lebensraum in the east,'" Krug audibly murmured from the background. Certainly not, I said, looking at him. That wouldn't support my point. The Germans are a nation with a country of their own, after all. I leave the issue of Lebensraum to others to defend. If you want me to name something inalienable in the present, I should say it's the values of European culture that can't be compromised in our fight with Bolshevism. Prudence is irrelevant when it comes to basic convictions. Must I elaborate on that? Certainly you should do so in your essay, though very briefly, Hinz said. Krug resumed his point. You can't deny that the last battle the Goths fought at Vesuvius was a useless sacrifice, a classic example of poor leadership. Did you consider that the alternative would have been slavery, women and children included? Hinz asked. I considered that lives would have been saved, lives that were vital for the survival of the Goths as such. Hasn't the Führer said that the survival of the species is the ultimate goal? Krug sneered. Life is only one of the values I mentioned, I cut in. There are others, like freedom, honour and duty. I need not explain that it may be necessary to sacrifice one for the other, do I? And it was for the king to weigh and decide. That's what he was elected for. He was not free to decide, Krug insisted. He was bound by his loyalty to his people. Teja, the last king, acted disloyally when he sent his men to their deaths. He led his people into ruin. The Goths were physically destroyed. After the Vesuvius battle, the Goths vanished from history. That is the reality we have to acknowledge. Now all of us felt the tension that had arisen in the classroom. By now the historical analogy was unmistakable. Krug had spoken as if he was the only realist in the room, while the others were pursuing insubstantial metaphysics. Reality? Hinz took up the argument. What actually is reality? I shall tell you. Reality is anything that is efficacious. If we are observing something that in some way has an effect on something else, we are facing reality. In this sense, aren't the Goths still present? Don't they affect our minds and perhaps even our actions? Don't they still influence our consciousness? Have they really vanished from history? Has Christ vanished from history? Have King Arthur or Dietrich von Bern? Have Mozart or Beethoven? I beg your pardon, sir, but how on earth can the Goths be named in one breath with Christ? Another classmate of ours interjected, relying on his authority as a pastor's son. Don't you see? Hinz continued. Christ lived and died to hand down a message that has lasted for nearly 2,000 years. Beethoven lived to give to mankind such music as his string quartet, Opus 131, as an everlasting present. The Goths may have come into existence and perished to give us a precedent of a people's will, of self-assertion, of collective courage, of honour, and of group loyalty to basic convictions. He paused, and then added as an afterthought, Of course, it always needs some sort of receptiveness on the side of later generations to make these forces efficacious, some open-mindedness, however naive or refined. Beethoven's string quartet doesn't have an impact on everybody. It needs some musical maturity to be effective. He smiled. People are different, aren't they? Outside, in front of our school, the park lay in the sun. Its sweeping lawns, chestnut-lined paths, flower beds and white benches made a beautiful sight, and our school building, with its classical facade, provided a pleasant counterpoint. The inscription under the pediment above the portal of our school read, Humanitatis Sapientiae, Wisdom is to serve mankind. Standing on the steps in front of the portal, I looked upon a scene of serene peace. Pupils of all ages between 10 and 18 were chatting, romping, playing and munching bread on the square under the chestnuts. My classmates stood divided into two clusters, apparently continuing our discussion. After so many years, I knew most of them well, their backgrounds and their way of thinking. I knew Krug would volunteer for a career as a medical doctor with the Luftwaffe, something that would guarantee him studies at the university safe from front service for the next several years. Two clusters, two factions, I thought. Idealists and pragmatists, those ready to make commitments and sacrifices for a cause reaching beyond themselves, and those who, for whatever reasons, were not. The epigraph under the pediment didn't say which one had the wisdom to serve humanity best. This wasn't the time for philosophy, however, I thought. It was the time for a firm commitment. I felt a sudden urge to demonstrate where I stood, and I wanted the difference between me and the other group to be great. As I was passing by the Krug group, I could overhear arguments in support of Krug that had not occurred to his cronies earlier. When Krug noticed me, I congratulated him. "Good show, Krug. I was impressed. I hope I have convinced you." "Certainly not. You wouldn't expect that, would you?" "Of course not. How could I?" he laughed. "I guess you found that idealistic stuff of Hinz's very exciting. How can you expect a prominent leader of the Yunguolk to be anything else than an idealist, praising honor, loyalty, duty and all that? Why so sarcastic? Do I detect an urge to justify your special choice for a military career?" "I need not justify anything. In case you're hinting at my volunteering for the Luftwaffe, try this. I'll volunteer for a doctor's career, because there must be doctors to stitch together people like you who can't wait for their dreams of glory to come true. Let's be honest, we haven't noticed your medical vocation or any other humanitarian conviction before, have we? Why hide the true reason? It's so obvious." "Speaking of honesty, what kind of contribution are you going to make anyway?" he snapped back. I hesitated for a moment, looking at him and the others of his group as they watched me. But my answer had been on my mind for a long time. Philip's example, my talks with him, my intent to do something beyond the average, and now this sudden urge to make the difference between us evident. Why not abandon my last reservations now? Wasn't everything clear? It was a matter of self-respect, and it was the right moment to make my decision. "Me?" I said. "Why, I'll join the Waffen-SS." "So you are determined to volunteer? All right then, but why the Waffen-SS?" "It's hard to explain," I said. "I just think that's where I belong." My father and I were sitting across from one another at a table in the large waiting room of the Holstadt station, sipping hot ersatz coffee among a throng of other people, mostly servicemen. We had arrived by train on a small private railway line that served the Harz Mountains and linked Blesheim to the Reichsbahn net. He was on his way back to the front. He wore his artillery major's uniform, looked rested and his old self, tall, handsome, trustworthy, and self-confident in his own way. "Now listen, Johann. I have talked to a regimental comrade of mine. He can manage to bring you into my old regiment at Hanover if you would volunteer there. It's a distinguished regiment with a distinguished name, Scharnhorst, as you know. There you could do your duty just as well. To me, it would be a great relief to know there were people higher up who would keep an eye on you." With all his usually good spirits, he now seemed worried. His hopes for a short war, and for his sons to be spared his own experience as a front-line soldier, had not been realized. He had seen his eldest son sent to the front lines of the notorious Centre Sector in Russia as an artillery forward observer, hardly a safe assignment, and now his second was striving for perhaps even riskier ventures. Also, he had first-hand experience of the last winter at Smolensk, where he was in charge of keeping the fleets of motor vehicles of the Centre Sector rolling, always facing the possibility of a total collapse of the front. Rather taciturn on serious matters, during his leave he made some remarks from which I gathered that in these dark months things had been on a razor's edge, and that he had his doubts about the outcome of the war. I suddenly felt sorry for him. He used to be such a devoted father when the four of us were still children. On weekends he would often take the family out in the car for picnics or searching for mushrooms in the mountains. At our insistence in the evenings, he would play his guitar and sing, mostly English and Australian songs from his boyhood. We were enchanted and used to know all the melodies and the words, except for their meaning. There were merry songs and some that were sad, but my father was never sad in those days. Now I was not sure of that any more, in spite of what he allowed others to see. "You know," I said, hoping to get through with this matter as quickly as possible, "I so much wanted to serve with a mountain division, and this is my chance. Can you understand?" "Are you sure you will get what you want? You might get neither the mountains nor any other adventures you may think of. Believe me, war for the infantryman in the front line is nasty. And in the rear, there are assignments for the SS of a kind I want you even less to get mixed up with. Why not join a nice, decent, traditional regiment? Now that I remember our talk, I wonder what my father had in mind when he referred to the assignments with the SS in the rear. At that time, however, I did not pursue the point. Certainly it would be a privilege to serve with your regiment, I can see that. But I think that this war is different. It is not a war between Prussia and Napoleon as in Scharnhorst's day. It's even no longer between Germany and her adversaries as it was in your time. It is between European civilization and Bolshevism. It's time for beginning a new tradition, one built by European youth. That is what I want to take part in. I probably used some more arguments and talked somewhat more gently and certainly more clumsily. In my father's ears, what I said might have even sounded like propaganda, but I did say that I was going my own way and why. He must have understood, for he dropped the matter without further comment. Perhaps it was also because of his strong dislike for discussing abstract subjects, all isms in particular. He often covered what was going on inside himself with a quick change to cheerfulness. He looked at his watch and briskly put on his gloves. "Well, before we part, let's have a drink, soldier," he said, smiling, while he rose and moved me to the bar. I saw him off on the platform. Both of us were experiencing another one of those gloomy goodbyes on a railway station in wartime. We did our best to get through it. When the train pulled out, my father remained standing behind the window of the door of his coach, lifting his hand in a military salute. As the last coach slid by, it cleared the view of another train, a goods train as it appeared, slowly passing by on the track behind the one next to the platform. Lost in thought, I noticed at first only the freshly painted propaganda slogans across the wagons. Then, looking more closely at the wall of a wagon opposite me, I became conscious, with a sudden chill, of what seemed to be fingers, yellowish human fingers, clinging to a few square holes in the side wall. Behind strings of barbed wire, I saw human eyes, dark and wide open, trying to catch a glimpse of the outside world. Stunned, I gazed upon the long row of wagons. Now and then, one of those little holes with fingers and eyes slowly shunted out of sight. Strong as it was, the sight left me with mixed feelings. Vae victis, woe to the vanquished, scum of the earth, poor devils. I hope they will be put to some decent work in the field. This thought, however, also occurred to me. Never must the dictatorship of the proletariat prevail in Europe. My memory of my last fall at home is marked by two different episodes at different places. In Brunswick, another encounter with Uncle Peter, revealing his predicament as a neutral, and in Hardenberg with Philip watching the flight of wild geese, giving wings to a romanticism which cannot go unmentioned in a true account of my war years. The wind was blowing down the first leaves from the chestnut trees on the wall in Brunswick. The large yellow-fingered remnants of summer were glued to the ground, soaked with the rain. On this day in October 1942, my grandparents' house was still there, its charming white facade defying the turn of the season. From there, across the pond, through the thinning foliage of the chestnut trees, one could see the manor on the island, where some years ago the SS had set up their local headquarters. I was on my way home from a pre-military training camp in the Westerwald, stopping over for a short visit to my Aunt Isa. I also hoped to see Philip, whom I knew to be home waiting for his next assignment. 3 weeks of hard training behind me, I was glad to be back in civilization. My grandmother had died from heart failure earlier that year. Afterwards, things had changed rapidly in the house. Approaching the entrance, I was bluntly reminded of the new situation when I bumped into an SS officer coming out of the house, not in the field grey uniform I was used to from the weeks in the camp, but in the black and silver of the Allgemeiner, general or political, SS. He was wearing riding breeches and immaculately polished riding boots, an attire that I never could help finding somewhat silly in the absence of a horse. The ground floor and the first floor of the house were leased to the SS as a convenient annex to their headquarters. Isa was now living in her new apartment in the attic. She used to call it her Himmelreich, Elysium. It was an entirely new, enchanting place, with the finest and most precious pieces of furniture, paintings, and books of the old household. Climbing up the stairs, I even sensed the same old fragrance of lavender, now mixed with a faint smell of fresh paint. The flat had turned out to be an exquisite place for Isa to live indeed. It was on this occasion that I saw the Swedes again. My Uncle Peter was there with Greta. Peter and his family had come to Germany in May, after his prospects in Stockholm had rapidly dwindled. I knew he had lost his position with a British firm by the end of 1939, and they had since been living off their savings and odd jobs. Somehow he seemed to have lost his British passport too, which must have meant a radical change in his status. Moreover, as he had indicated in one of his letters, with the German army entering the Soviet Union, it had become clear to him that now the war would drag on for a long time, and that he couldn't hope simply to wait out his uncomfortable situation. Eventually he was offered a position in Brunswick by an old friend of his. They had taken the opportunity, packed up their belongings, now in storage, and moved into a furnished apartment right in the neighbourhood of Isa's place on the wall. There was a great hullabaloo when I found the three of them in Isa's sitting room. We had not seen each other since our last meeting at Hardenberg 4 years earlier. They still looked as I had remembered them, attractive, elegant, cosmopolitan. Peter's fancy shoes made it obvious that he had been living abroad. Greta was smoking a small black cigar, most unusual too. Altogether they were a bright spot in our bleak wartime surroundings. Yet, for all the familiarity between us, it was an odd situation. I was wearing my navy blue uniform of the Jungvolk, and in those days I was used to seeing men of Peter's age in field grey uniforms. The Swedes, in contrast, were utterly civilian. There was another thing, too. Somehow I felt I had just intruded into a situation of which I had no knowledge. They watched with curiosity while I gave a brief account of my trip from the Westerwald and of my pre-military training. They may have been comparing what I, a young German, was doing at this stage in life, with the activities of my Swedish contemporaries, namely more peaceful diversions like sailing, tennis, and travelling abroad. "How did you like it up there, you and your comrades?" Peter asked. "It can't have been fun." I tried a bit of irony and quoted casually, "We left proudly conscious of having gladly done our duty. Im stolzen Bewusstsein freudig erfüllte Pflicht." He roared with laughter, as he was able to do at any moment. "Proudly conscious of having—" "What? Gladly. Done our duty. That's wonderful. That's simply wonderful. Where did you get that?" His eyes were watering. "It's a quotation," I explained when he had calmed down. "It's from the Army Regulation book. Nicely put, after all, isn't it?" "All the same, I'm afraid it is above my head," Peter said, now chuckling good-naturedly. "Did you really enjoy your training?" "You've become thin, Johann," Isa said. "It looks as if they've let you starve." "It was a bit tough, yes. No fun and games." "Not even some little war games?" Peter teased. "Not exactly. Rather a lot of field training, topography, cross-country marches, that kind of stuff. No military drill, if you mean that. Not in the usual sense, at least. Much different." "Well, it sounds as if something new is going on," Peter continued bantering. "Perhaps it's the new secret weapon everyone is talking about. A secret weapon in the making up there in the hills of the Hunsrück. German youth, vintage 1925, best quality, tough as leather, hard as Krupp steel, quick as greyhounds. Wasn't this what the Führer used to say of the Hitler Youth? It should have occurred to us earlier." "Peter, please, don't be at it again," Greta interrupted. "Next time they won't let you off so easily." She seemed disturbed. "Did I say anything wrong?" he protested with an air of innocence. "Or is somebody listening?" Facetiously he looked around and under the table. I found him amusing as ever, and to humour him I said, "Don't mind me. Besides, in a certain sense, you could even be right. In the camp, the Waffen-SS is picking the best of the livestock as volunteers for a new division. Rumour has it that it'll be called Hitlerjugend." "Won't you tell Johann what brought us here at this hour?" Greta now asked Peter. Why, yes, of course, he began, unfolding an extraordinary story. It had started a few days before. Late one afternoon, he and his colleagues had a little chat at the office, a friend of his to whom he owed his present job among them. They were quite at ease. One of them, an agreeable chap for all Peter knew of him, got rather boastful about the latest achievements of the German army in Russia, and, in consequence, about the general prospects for the war. After a while, Peter couldn't help butting in. "You fellows don't believe in earnest we can win the war, do you?" This had stopped the boasting immediately, but at the same moment the room had fallen into dead silence. Afterward, Peter's friend had given him to understand that the group had been a little too large for such loose talk. 3 days later, Peter got a summons from the Gestapo. First, he didn't know what to think of it. It could be a matter of routine. Gradually, however, Greta and he had become upset. On that day, on that very morning, he had been there and had returned only some hours before. Arriving at the room indicated in the summons, he was told that the chief himself wanted to see him. That's either good or very bad, he thought. When he was let into the chief's office, however, he saw to his greatest surprise his old pal and schoolmate, Manny, now in charge of the local Gestapo section. As soon as the door closed behind him, Manny immediately fell into their old relationship. "Man alive! Peter! It's really you! I couldn't believe it at first. Have a seat. How did it go since we left school? You must tell me. First of all, though, you're lucky I got hold of that silly report on your talk in the office. For heaven's sake, Peter, stop talking that sort of nonsense. You can get yourself into real trouble by that. Please do me a favour and hold your tongue next time. Promise." And with that, the whole matter was dropped. Afterwards, they had a long chat that had lasted almost until noon. Now, here he was, back again, counting himself lucky. Isa brought in some snacks she had been preparing in the kitchen, where she had overheard Peter's account anew. "You forgot to mention, my dear," she said to Peter, "that I, too, was scared to death. I didn't have a wink of sleep last night. I thought, even if they didn't lock you up, they surely could make you regret you returned to Germany altogether." I well remember how at that point Peter's mood changed from his usual bantering to deadly earnest. "Germany or elsewhere, does it really matter? I think people like us can always be sure of the attention of the police anywhere else, one way or the other," Peter replied. "Do I regret being back in Germany? I don't think that's the question. There is no room for regret, nor for delight for that matter, because you are forced to take sides, no matter how much you feel that it's none of your business." "Well," Isa remarked, "you're not the only one in that condition. There are a lot of other people who hate to make choices in that way, no matter where they may live, here or abroad. Certainly, I can even imagine many Germans thinking this war is none of their business. It's pretty obvious, but with me it's different. There's nothing I owe to Germany, as little as I owe to any other country. Neither have I been a dissident in any way. So where is the justification for forcing me into this situation? Can you explain that to me? Real citizens of a state owe loyalty, an acronym which stood for Geheime Staatspolizei, or the Secret State Police. Because of certain advantages they've been enjoying and hope to enjoy later: security, education, opportunities in life, public welfare, and what have you. With me, it's different. I didn't even study here. And afterwards, no opportunities at all. I had to go abroad. In England, I arrived penniless. And why is that? Because my home country was unable to protect my father's property against confiscation by the British. Securities, in fact, he earned through lifelong hard work. So, after the First War, there was nothing left but this house. On the other hand, I haven't worked against this state either. So I ask you, who has the right to force me to take sides? To whom do I owe loyalty?" He paused. Our talk had taken a serious turn, and then he added more calmly, "I have tried to stay out of this chauvinistic contest between European countries, but it didn't work. Europe is still too immature. Can you imagine anything more immature than countries waging this war?" Interesting as I found his view, at that time it didn't sink in. I was already too committed. Besides, many questions were left open, but I thought it would be better to leave it at that. Otherwise it would lead to an endless, perhaps unpleasant discussion. Greta was keen to get going. "We shouldn't keep the child waiting too long," she said. They had left their little daughter at home with their landlord. Peter, too, seemed to be glad to end our talk and say goodbye. "Are we going to see you again tomorrow?" Peter asked me. "I'm afraid not. I'll be leaving this evening for a stopover at Hardenberg. Philip will be with me on the train. Philip von Bergdorf. You met him 4 years ago, remember?" "Yes, I remember," Greta exclaimed. "Wasn't he the lad living next door?" "How is he doing?" Greta asked. "He's doing fine. He just finished his course at Officers' Candidate School here at Brunswick. Just now he's on leave, waiting for his new assignment." "Officers' Candidate School here in Brunswick? Are you saying he is with the Waffen-SS?" Peter asked, quite startled, knowing that there was no other Officers' Candidate School at Brunswick. "That's right. He was transferred to the Waffen-SS early this year," I replied. "You mean he was forced to? I can't imagine anyone of his family wanting to mix up with that bunch." "Whatever you think, he has volunteered." Shaking his head, he muttered, "I really think I need some more education to understand what is going on over here." I saw them out. On my way up to Isa's flat, I kept wondering about what I had heard. What did Peter mean by being forced to take sides? Had there been some pressure other than his economic situation? Isa was a bit surprised when she found me uninformed about the circumstances of Peter's return to Germany. It had been late in 1940 when he had applied for the extension of his passport's validity, not knowing what lay ahead for him. At first, the people at the British Embassy had been very nice. It was only months later that Peter realized they were stalling. Then, one day, he was given to understand that his case could easily be solved by some sort of cooperation on his part. Eventually, they came up with an idea that must have been their intention from the beginning. They suggested that he should sign up with the British intelligence in the UK. They said that for him, because of his German origin and his command of several languages, there were various opportunities to make himself useful during the war. They offered to move his family to the UK at their expense. Unfortunately, however, they said, apologising for the inconvenience, Greta and her daughter were to be taken care of in an internment camp, for security reasons, whatever that meant. Peter refused, but as a result he deprived himself of all chances to get his passport renewed. He then applied for a German passport. The people at the German embassy were eager to help, happy about the prodigal son, but they too had their conditions. He got his passport by the end of the year, but only on the condition that he return to Germany as soon as possible. I felt sorry for Peter and Greta. All of this must have been very distressing for them. "They must feel as though they're wandering about in no man's land," I said. "Why didn't our own people make use of him in Sweden, the country being neutral? One should think that there were enough opportunities for someone like Peter. Aren't we getting most of our iron ore from there, for instance?" "He has tried that, of course, but I understand they preferred their own people, party liners or people of similar reliability," Isa said. "It's too bad. He can't be too happy with his German passport. How is Greta taking it?" "For Greta, it seems quite natural to stand by his side. Both have come to terms with the situation as it is. That is my impression. Think of the alternative. And then, she's the daughter of a German Navy captain, after all. Mother was grateful for the opportunity to start a new life when she married father after the war, but the old ties still hold. I know in a way it's also true of Greta." At the station, Philip was in uniform. I had not seen him in his Waffen-SS uniform before, and from a distance I didn't recognize him for a moment. Looking back to that morning, I still have the sight clearly in my mind. It is a strange thing with uniforms. To a certain degree, they seem to lend a new identity to a person. In most cases, of course, people just appear to change from civilians to soldiers. In doing so, however, some gain in stature, others change from vulgar to pompous, as in the case of most party officials, and some again change from sensible to ridiculous figures. With Philip, it was different altogether. The grey, high-buttoned tunic with the ribbon of the Iron Cross emphasized certain qualities of his that could be observed even before: his modest nobility, his serene commitment to serve, a trace of ascesis. The uniform made him look still young and seemed to preserve much of the image of the popular Jungvolk leader I had known in the summer camp. That and his youthful intrepidity were stressed by the peaked cap of grey cloth with the black band and the death's head badge in front. He was wearing it a bit askew and had removed the stiffener from inside to make the cap look worn and unpretentious. So much was he a personality of his own that the 2 silver runes on the black collar patches and the silvery belt buckle with the epigraph Meine Ehre heißt Treue, my honour is my loyalty, seemed to be symbols of his very own loyalty to the values he had imparted to me early that year. Our compartment was empty so that our talk flowed easily from the start. Philippe's wish to be posted to the Viking, where most of the non-German European volunteers were serving, had come true as he had learned only the day before. He was all enthusiasm, looking forward to his new assignment. In a few days he would be on his way down to the south of Russia. He would take command of a rifle platoon, and before long he would be promoted to Untersturmführer. At that time, we, that is my age group, still being at school, were rather well informed about where the front lines ran, especially in the east. At home, many of us used to follow our army's positions by sticking little brightly coloured pins on large wall maps in our rooms, indicating the towns, rivers, or territories that were the topics of the daily news. It was a habit taken up during the early years of the war and gladly resumed at the next Sondermeldung, announcing further advances of our forces. So I was aware of the German summer offensive in southern Russia, the powerful thrust toward the oil fields behind the Caucasus Mountains by the Caspian Sea. I also knew that the Viking was somewhere in that region. Although he did not have much to say about the actual operations, I listened all the more to what Philip said about the strategic design behind it all. He said it wasn't only that control of the oil wells was an absolute necessity for winning the war, but that reaching the Volga River was equally important. Only then would the way north be open to envelop the Russian armies around Moscow. 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, or Viking. Rank taken from the general SS organization, equivalent to second lieutenant. Plus special radio news reporting important events on the war theatres, each time dramatically announced by a blast of trumpets and followed by the playing of military marches. Naturally, I was impressed. This was, I think, the first time I got a vague notion of the economic meaning of the war, its opportunities and its limits. I was confident, though, that the limits of our oil supply would be stretched by the far-sighted leadership of the Führer. At that time, in October 1942, however, it was known that our troops had become mixed up in ferocious battles in the Caucasus, as well as on their way farther up to the Volga, and even from our radio news, it appeared that our advance was making only little progress, or, as in the mountains, had virtually come to a halt. Therefore, Philip's optimism was an invitation for raising doubts from my side about the successful outcome of the operation. He was confident all the same. As our success was an absolute must for winning the war, he said, all our strength was being concentrated in that region. Didn't I know that some advance units of ours had already reached the Caspian shore? Moreover, he said, the stream of young volunteers from Europe into the divisions of the Waffen-SS had even become stronger during the last year. It was bound to grow further, the more it became evident for the public outside Germany that she needed help to crush the Bolshevik menace. For me, all that made this train ride memorable. At the same time, I was proud to join the organization that would allow me to make my own contribution. Meanwhile, the compartment had filled with country people. An elderly lady seemed to take an interest in the bits she could pick up from our talk, so we let our conversation take a more general course. Upon our arrival at Hardenberg, Philip took the occasion to pay a call on my grandmother. We found the house, at first sight, unaffected by the war. Against the setting of the garden and the forest, both in full colour, it looked as beautiful as ever. The lawns, however, had turned into wild meadows with high grass. On the old tennis court, potatoes were being grown, hens were pecking in the chicken yard, and the hedges badly needed trimming. Inside we found my mummy, now doing much of the housework herself. Ida was fully occupied with her function as head of the local women's organisation, boosting people's morale at the home front. At present, she was organising a collection of warm clothes for the soldiers at the front. Stena had become a nurse again and was serving with the Red Cross somewhere in southern Russia. Although the last days had been chilly, the central heating system of the house was not in operation. Only in the sitting room and the adjoining library did the green-tiled stove radiate a comfortable heat. The library had become Mummy's favourite room in recent years, where she was near Schopenhauer, Nietzsche and Spengler, the philosophers she used to read quite thoroughly, as appeared from her annotations in the margins that I had found some time ago. She was pleased to see us, and seemed to relish the vivid conversation now going on between her and the younger generation. She dignified the occasion by offering us some of her sherry, which she asked me to fetch from downstairs. Given her critical mind, I think that Philippe's sober account of his duties and experiences must have been a relief to her in comparison to Ida's way of amplifying the party line at home. Ida came in just as Philippe was about to leave. Obviously she was impressed by his appearance in uniform, and when she heard that he was going back to the front, she seized him by his shoulders, focusing her blue eagle eyes on him as if bidding farewell to a warrior marching to the battlefield the next minute. Outside it was dark, the sky brilliant with stars. As we were standing at the gate, there were strange sounds high up in the air, very faintly at first, but gradually becoming more distinct, a jumble of shrill cries growing louder and louder. Suddenly we saw them coming, quite discernible now, 2 or 3 huge wedge-like flights of geese high up, steadily beating their wings, their long necks stretched forward, coming from the far north and flying southward across the mountains. We looked up in awe, our hearts moving along with the graceful birds that took no heed of the turmoil on the earth, that knew no borders and no war, only following the peaceful call of their nature. Both of us had Walter Flex's verses in mind, Wild Ganze rauschen durch die Nacht, verses widely known among us and full of foreboding. We watched and listened until the last sound had faded away. I felt the sudden appearance of the geese held a deeper meaning. It was a sign, a call for duty. We didn't know then that disaster was imminent in the east. Soon after, the retreat from the Caucasus began, and the catastrophe of Stalingrad was on the way. I was not to see Philip again. February 1943. Our platoon had ascended the steep slope on skis in combat gear with full equipment. We assembled on the saddle of the Toriner Joch, some 1,800 metres above the Königssee on one side and the valley of the Salzach on the other. Panting and leaning on our ski poles, we enjoyed the short break. Clad in snow shirts with hoods drawn over our mountain caps, we were discernible only by the machine guns, the rifles, and our other military equipment against the general whiteness of our surroundings, a whiteness that dazzled in the intense midday sun. Some had removed their caps and revealed sharp contrasts between the white skin of their hairlines and the dark tan of their faces. Our lips were covered with a thick layer of cream, and our eyes were protected by blue-tinted glasses with gleaming aluminum frames. We had received our tans during field training over the last few weeks. The time had proved extremely demanding, making up for the absence of the military drill that regular recruits must endure on the parade ground. Accommodations were of Spartan simplicity. Put up in 2 lodges, one on top and the other huddled to the side of the saddle, the company rose at dawn, washed outside in the snow, performed calisthenics, ate breakfast, and then began ski instruction and other high mountain training, such as traversing ice fields, building igloos, and so on. The snow on the ridge was hard and iced over, as the wind up here gave no rest to anything loose, and the sun melted what was left of the fresh snow. Less than 10 kilometres away, the white massif of the Watzmann stood out against the dark blue sky. Here, on our side of the lake, the Hoher Goll and the Schneibstein towered north and south of the saddle. The spectacular tableau was a grand sight indeed. Looking around, in the midst of my comrades, I thought that this was what I had wanted. Before we finished the morning's exercise, we would have one more downhill run. At the moment, we were practicing gun displacement. Our machine guns were mounted on akjas, small boat-like sleds that were guided by 3 men harnessed to each, 2 in front and the machine gunner in the back. The first gun got ready. Rifles tightly slung across the back and ammunition cases strapped to the body, the 3 men with the Akia formed their triangle and off they went. The leader went ahead, the machine gun unit behind, the other Jaeger following, all of them rushing down in wide swinging turns, moving in full harmony. The last week's ski training was paying off. Soon they would disappear behind a rock, and then it was our turn. Fresh snow fell in the afternoon. We returned to the lodge early. After supper, I stood guard duty for the first 2 hours of the night. Gusts of wind drove snow over the ridge and around the house, piling up drifts in the lee. Inside, in the light shining through the curtains, my comrades were singing. Our repertoire then had a distinct South Tyrolean touch, for the majority of our company came from that region. Their national anthem, a song of gladness and praise of South Tyrol, had become the battalion's main song. Wie ist die Welt so groß und weit und voller Sonnenschein, das allerschönste Stück davon ist doch die Heimat mein. In the cramped room with the large tiled stove, the men sat tightly packed around ash tables, scrubbed white. The NCOs were among them, and the company commander, Hauptsturmführer von Hartmann, dropped in regularly. We recruits respected him greatly, and he seemed to have a soft spot in his heart for us. His training program was tough, but he always ensured that we found pleasure in the performance of our duty. He was a handsome man and had style. Dark-haired, cultivated, of Bavarian nobility, his mother allegedly came from Hungary. In his features, however, there were also distinct marks of toughness and willpower. A wounded leg forced him to walk with a stick, which he did with grace. The iron cross on the left side of his tunic added to the overall image of a seasoned veteran whom we could admire and be inspired to emulate. Often on those evenings at the lodge, he would play his guitar and teach us new songs. When I was relieved from the guard post, a welcome surprise was waiting for me. Our platoon leader ordered me and 3 others to go down to the village of Königssee the next morning for provisions. To receive that duty was a privilege, almost as good as being on leave. Normally our supplies would come up with the mules, but when there was heavy snowfall, more than 1 metre deep, the pack animals, with their large wicker baskets strapped to their sides, would get stuck before they reached our station. Living the life of monks, every one of us used to look forward to a few hours of village life, no matter how innocent the diversions offered. There was another very special reason for my anticipation. If I was lucky, I would find Christina there. As I learned from her last letter, as a leader of the Jungmadel, she was assigned to one of the hotels at Königssee that had been turned into a camp of the Kinderlandverschickung, KLV. She should have arrived there by now. Unfortunately, though, I didn't know at which hotel she would be staying.